You arrive at the edge of a village, but there are no voices, no smoke, no carts creaking through dirt, just silence, thick and humming, and the smell, rot layered over ash, fat over feces, something that used to be human, now soaked in something that isn't. You step through the gate and find no guards, no dogs, no movement. The houses are open, doors swinging slightly. One has black handprints on the inside wall, too small to be those of a man. There are bodies, but not the kind you expect. Some are whole, some are not. One still breathes barely, curled against a tree with eyes open wide and glassy. He does not blink. And then you hear it, a sound like chewing, wet, repetitive. You follow it, even when your legs beg not to. You know what you're going to find. You always do. The man is sitting in the doorway of what was probably a schoolhouse. His hands are red. His face too. His mouth moves slowly, jaw clicking. The thing in his lap is small. Software wrapped in rags, except where it's not. He doesn't look at you. He doesn't run. He just chews. Later someone will say he was a survivor, that his family died first, that he was the only one strong enough to stay upright, to search for food, to light fires. And then he started talking to shadows, started sleeping standing up, started forgetting names, even his own. Until the hunger changed him. That's the part they always whisper. It wasn't murder, it was the sickness. You think it's madness, starvation, a mind that shattered under too many nights with nothing but the echo of your child's breath before it vanished. But the locals have a word for it. They say it's a plague, not the kind that eats lungs or boils the skin. This one eats from the inside. It starts with tremors, then the fever, then the forgetting, and finally, the change. The part where something human peels away and something else takes its place. No, this isn't the plague that history writes about. It doesn't have a name, doesn't travel in ships or trade caravans, but it spreads the same way, by desperation, by breath, by memory that turns against you. They bury the bodies, but not the man. They say it wouldn't help. He's already gone. Some say he walked into the river days later. Others say he sits by the edge of the forest now, still chewing, no longer hungry. And when the spring came, the village was abandoned. The buildings collapsed. The grass grew through the floorboards. The wind carried the story somewhere else. But that's the first sign, isn't it? When they stop writing it down. Because a plague that turns people into monsters is easy to record. But a plague that turns you into one, that's a story no one wants to admit was real. It began with one woman. She stepped into the street on a hot July morning and started to dance. No music, no drums, no applause, just her heels slapping against stone, her dress whipping with every spin, her hair slick with sweat. Her eyes stayed open too long, her arms moved like puppets, and her mouth hung slack, not smiling, not frowning, just open. At first they laughed, called her drunk, called her a curse and called her holy, but she didn't stop, not when her legs buckled, not when her feet bled, not when she collapsed in the dust and clawed her way upright again. She danced through the night, and by dawn, 3 more had joined her. By the end of the week it was 34, by the second week it was over 400. Men, women, children, all were moving endlessly. No rhythm, no coordination, just jerking limbs, twisting hips, eyes rolled back or locked in terror. Some begged for rest and screamed to be tied down. Others laughed until they vomited. One priest recorded the sound as a market of bones and shrieks. But no one could explain it. Doctors said it was hot blood. The body needed to release excess heat through movement. They prescribed more dancing. A stage was built. Musicians hired. The sick were brought there, pushed up under sun and drumbeat, forced to dance until they collapsed into their waste. Many never rose again. Feet split open, ankles snapped. tongues bitten clean through. One woman danced herself into labour. The baby did not survive. Neither did she. It wasn't just physical. The dancers spoke in fragments, saw figures in windows that weren't there. One man swore the Virgin Mary danced beside him, holding a torch made of teeth. Another said he had heard screaming under the cobblestones, as if hell had split beneath their feet. The bishop declared it demonic. He ordered processions, incense and exorcisms, but still they danced, even when chained to walls, even when wrists were shattered from the strain, even when nails peeled off and their knees ground to powder. The plague moved through movement, through sight, through fear. Neighbours watched the dancers, then joined them. Children imitated the convulsions, laughing until they couldn't stop. It lasted weeks. When it finally ended, hundreds were dead. Many more were broken, limbs permanently twisted, minds shattered, voices never returning to whole words. The city fell into silence, afraid to play music, afraid to sing, scared to move too fast, because no one ever found a cause. Some blamed ergot poisoning, a fungus in the rye, same as in other outbreaks. Others said it was mass psychosis, trauma, famine, grief, all erupting at once in the form of movement. But to those who saw it, those who buried their children still twitching, it was a plague, a new kind, a plague not of the lungs but of the mind, a sickness of rhythm, a virus made of hysteria and desperation. And if you stood still long enough, you could still hear the echo, the sound of shoes slapping stone, of a city dancing itself into the grave. He was a nobleman, that much they remembered, rich silks, rings on every finger, a silver goblet was always near his hand. But when the sickness took hold, none of it mattered. He started barking. At first it was a cough, then a growl, then snarls that shook the windows. His servants thought he was possessed. The priest refused to come inside, and when they finally opened his chamber door, they found him crouched on all fours, teeth bared, eyes red, mouth foaming, biting the leg of his bedpost like it had insulted him. The diagnosis came too late. Rabies. In the centuries before vaccines, it wasn't rare. It was a death sentence. The bite of a dog, a wolf, a bat. The most minor puncture could bloom into months of terror. It didn't hit fast, it hit cruelly. There were stages. First, the fear of water, of mirrors, of wind. Then, the panic, sudden rage, hallucinations, the feeling of insects crawling across the brain. Then came the spasms, the frothing, the snapping of teeth, the shrieks at the sunlight, the memory loss, the collapse, the death. But not before something else took over, something not quite human. There are court records, real ones, of bishops attacking their scribes, chewing off their ears, of noble children turning on their nurses, sinking their milk teeth into soft skin and refusing to let go, of entire towns locking up the bitten not to treat them, but to wait for the change. One French physician wrote, "They do not walk, they stalk, their fingers curl, their backs hunch, their eyes burn, and they will not die cleanly." People foamed at the mouth until they drowned in it. Some were buried early, gagged and strapped in linen, screaming beneath the dirt. Others were beaten to death with wooden poles, then burned, just in case their breath still carried poison. They called them biters, frenzied, moonstruck, but what they meant was zombie. The sickness moved in silence. There were no armies, no insects, no smoke from chimneys to signal contagion. Only one bite, one fever, one blink too long, and then the screaming began. In isolated villages, whole families were wiped out. One girl in Belgium bit off her fingers. A shepherd in Spain swallowed his tongue, trying to stop himself from crying out. There are even reports, half believed, mostly denied, of rulers locking up infected in dungeons, leaving them to gnaw at chains and each other in darkness, until death or madness claimed what was left. The cause? Unknown at the time. Some blamed sin, others the devil. A few even said it was the animal spirit inside the man, rising to reclaim its place. But now we know. A virus, carried in saliva, sharp enough to pierce the blood-brain barrier, fast enough to destroy everything you are, until your body moves without reason. Your voice barks instead of speaking, and your death comes too late to stop the damage. Not all plagues rot the skin, some rot the soul, and in those years, across castles and cabins and cobblestone towns, there were enough of them, foaming and staggering to make people wonder, what does it mean to walk still, if you've already disappeared inside? They called it Saint, Anthony's Fire, a name that sounded holy, healing, but the only thing that burned was flesh. It began with itching, tingling fingers, a warmth in the feet that wouldn't go away. Then came the pain, slow, rising, steady, like someone had lit a candle beneath your skin and refused to blow it out. Villagers stumbled barefoot into churches, screaming in terror. Fingers blackened, toes curled, limbs shriveled like dead wood. Some people danced, others twitched. One boy tried to bite through his wrist to stop the flames crawling up his arms, and they all begged for the same thing, to make it stop. This wasn't a fever. It wasn't a rash or cough or anything you could see in the air. It was inside the bread. Ergot, a fungus that infected rye, invisible until it was too late. The same bread eaten every day. Cheap, common, shared across tables, churches and prisons. And in some years, it turned entire towns into wailing pits of hallucination and rot. One woman in France said she saw her baby's face melt off in her arms, only to realise she was cradling a loaf of bread. A man in Germany stripped naked in the town square and begged the ravens overhead to pluck out his eyes. He said they were full of worms. Another group walked into the river singing. None of them came out, and while the madness raged, the body decayed. Dry gangrene set in. Blood stopped flowing. Limbs rotted from the outside in. Toes dropped off without bleeding. Arms turned to sticks. One woman's leg snapped off at the knee like a branch, and she didn't feel it. She laughed. It wasn't divine punishment. It wasn't demons. It was mould. But in the 11th, 12th and 13th centuries, no one knew. They called in priests, not physicians. They chanted and burned incense, drove the sick from the village, zombies in rags, left to rot beside the riverbank, twitching and mumbling, waiting for death or salvation. In one monastery, monks built stone beds, places where the afflicted could die alone. Visitors were warned not to look at their faces, because sometimes they smiled. Sometimes they whispered things in languages they'd never learned. Sometimes they stood up after days of silence and tried to walk back into town, without eyes, without tongues, without memory. But they still moved, and that was enough to terrify everyone who saw them. The worst part? The bread was never blamed. The wheat was harvested again, baked again, and passed to children again, because hunger is stronger than fear, and rot hides well in flour. They kept eating, and the sickness kept coming. Year after year, body after body, a plague with no scent, no shape, only the scream of those who had already disappeared, twitching in corners and speaking to ghosts, their mouths dusted with crumbs. You hear them before you see them, the dragging of feet, the groan that never rises above a whisper, the wet cough echoed down an empty alley. You press yourself to a wall, holding your breath, as a figure shuffles past. Their cloak is soaked black, but not with water. Their neck is swollen, a purple fist beneath the skin. Their jaw sags. Their eyes are glass. They don't see you, but you see them. They are not dead. Not yet. The year is 1348, and death doesn't ride on a horse. It walks, on two legs, slowly, always slowly. The Black Death does not kill instantly. It unravels, first with fever, then with chills, then with the swelling, under the arms, in the groin, behind the ears. Buboes, they called them. Soft at first, then hard, then leaking. People scratched at them in their sleep until they bled. Some cut them open with knives, hoping to drain the sickness. Most who did bleed out before the infection finished its work. In the final stages, the skin darkened, veins collapsed, fingers turned black and brittle, teeth fell out. The body became a leaking sack of organs, limping through alleys looking for water, or rest, or someone who hadn't yet locked their door. They moved in herds sometimes, driven from towns, sealed out of the gates, wanderers, rotting, not dead, not allowed to live. They slept in fields, shivered in barns, tried to speak but forgot how. And when the spasms began, the watchers whispered, "They'll die by morning." Sometimes they did, but sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they kept moving. One chronicler in Siena wrote, "I saw a woman crawling on her elbows, trailing one leg behind her, as if it no longer belonged. She was humming. Her tongue was black. The priests feared them. Some churches rang bells, not for the dying, but for the already infected, to warn others to stay indoors. If you saw someone strolling, coughing into a cloth, swollen and vacant-eyed, you stepped back. Because if you didn't, you'd be next. And in cities like Florence, London, Paris and Prague, it didn't matter how wealthy you were. They all bled the same. Doctors refused to enter homes. Families boarded up doors with relatives still alive inside. Servants ran. Gravediggers wore masks shaped like birds, stuffed with herbs, not to heal, but to mask the smell. The grave pits opened by the hundreds. The cartload dumped in people, but not all of them were dead. In Milan, a monk recorded that a hand reached up from a pile of corpses and was immediately struck down with a shovel. They couldn't risk mercy. The sickness was faster than compassion. By the end of it, over 25 million people were gone. Whole villages were emptied. Fields grew wild. Dogs chewed on remains in the street. But what people remembered most weren't the corpses. It was the ones who moved, the ones who staggered, black with rot, eyes unseeing, hands outstretched. Not for violence, not for food, but for someone to tell them they were still human. They didn't get it. They died on the road, in corners, in closets, forgotten. And centuries later, their shadows still linger in the stories we tell of undead things. But they weren't monsters. They were just the sick, still walking, already gone. It began with a giggle. One boy walking home from the coast, hands stained with fish scales. He looked up at nothing and laughed. Once, then again, then again. By morning he was convulsing. They say the village was small, just a few dozen houses on the southern islands near the old forests, isolated, no bridges, only boats, which meant that when the sickness spread, there was nowhere to run. First, the boy's mother laughed, then his sister, then the neighbours. Not joy, not amusement, something deeper, broken. They laughed until they gasped, until they clawed at their throats, until blood bubbled at their noses and they collapsed in silence, legs twitching like caught fish. The priest called it a Kore curse, a ghost sickness, but the symptoms were physical, tremors, muscle rigidity, facial contortions. Some couldn't speak, some forgot their names, others still smiled, even as their teeth cracked from grinding. When the fishing nets came in full of rotted sea flesh, the villagers said it was a sign. When the well turned black, they stopped drinking. But still, the giggling spread. It wasn't just laughter, there were hallucinations. One girl described her grandmother's face peeling off mid-conversation. A fisherman stabbed his own eyes after swearing he saw a mouth in the sky, laughing with 1,000 teeth. Within a week, 23 villagers were dead. Not from wounds, not from starvation, from something no one could explain. The island was quarantined. Official records list it simply as neurological fever, unconfirmed, unresolved. But one surviving monk wrote in a private scroll, "They smiled too long. Their joy did not come from the heart. It came from a deeper hunger. And when they died, their eyes were still laughing." Modern scholars suggest Kuru, a prion disease like mad cow, was triggered by contaminated food or genetic vulnerability. Others blame mass psychogenic illness, panic that turned physical through shared trauma. But even science can't fully explain how a whole village began to rot from the brain outward. No fever, no rash, just the laughter and the silence that followed. Years later, when the government tried to reclaim the island, they found bones in beds, some curled together, some sprawled mid-step, mouths still open, teeth clenched tight. The huts had collapsed. Nature had returned, but the air still felt wrong. Fishermen refused to cast near those shores. Monks warned that the dead there did not rest in peace, and some said, if the wind blew right, you could still hear it. The sound of joy twisted into something monstrous, because the plague didn't kill like others. It stole the body last, the mind took first, until all that remained was a smile and the shadow of a laugh no one wanted to remember. They arrived in November, French missionaries, trappers, a Jesuit doctor with half-frozen ink and a Latin Bible. They built their chapel from rotting wood and skinned logs, deep in the northern forests of what is now Canada. Snow had already begun to fall, and no one knew how long the winter would last. It would be months, months of silence, of ice, of meat gone hard with frost, of prayers that went unanswered. And then one day, a boy went missing. They said he wandered off into the forest. Then another vanished, then another. When they broke into the log hut where a fur trader had been sheltering with his wife and children, they found him crouched over the fire, boiling bones. Not an animal, not deer, small, human. His eyes were blank, his lips cracked. He whispered something the Jesuits couldn't understand. They dragged him into the snow, tied him to a post, and prayed. They buried what was left of the others behind the chapel, and they didn't speak of it again. But that was just the first case. That winter, more followed. Men who tore flesh from corpses, women who gnawed on the frozen arms of their children, people who chewed bark until their teeth broke and then turned to something softer. It wasn't just starvation, it was something else. The natives had a name for it, Wendigo. Not a monster that came from the outside, one that grew inside you. It began with hunger, then visions, then a cold that no longer hurt. You would stop shivering, you would stop crying, you would feel strong again, and that's when the change began. There are letters, real ones, written by Jesuit chroniclers, describing men who laughed while eating human flesh, who spoke with voices that didn't sound like their own, who claimed they saw God inside the bodies they consumed. One missionary wrote, "They did not seem mad, they did not plead, they did not speak, they only ate, and when we tried to stop them, they bit us. The worst part, they knew what they were doing. Some begged to be tied down before the hunger took them, some asked to be killed, some locked themselves inside cabins and set them on fire. Better to burn than to consume. When spring came, half the mission was dead, the rest were silent." The official report listed the deaths as exposure. The actual cause was never mentioned, but the locals remembered, and years later, in nearby settlements, parents warned their children, "Don't speak to the pale ones in the snow. Don't follow the sound of chewing. Don't eat what they offer you, even if it looks like food, even if it smells like soup, even if they're smiling." Because the Wendigo does not come howling. It comes quietly, through the cold, through hunger, through something inside you that cracks, then crumbles, then disappears, until nothing is left, except appetite. It's not gone, it just changed names. They don't call it a plague now, they call it a disorder, a syndrome, an episode, something to code, file, and bill. But the bodies still twitch, the eyes still go glassy, and people still wander, silent, shaking, somewhere between pain and forgetting. You've seen them in alleyways, on sidewalks, in psych wards, waiting rooms and prison cells. They shiver in coats made for summer, talk to voices no one else hears, move like the strings of their bodies have been cut and retied. Wrong! Doctors say it's neurological degeneration, or methamphetamine psychosis, or fentanyl-induced catatonia. But what it looks like, it is something ancient. A man found outside a Nevada motel, barefoot in the snow, chewing his fingers. A woman in Brazil who danced for 6 days, then collapsed, foaming at the mouth. A teenage boy in a Syrian refugee camp who hasn't spoken in a year, just hums, rocks, hums, rocks. In the Philippines, a group of schoolchildren once screamed and clawed at walls for hours, convinced they were being chased by shadows with no legs. Doctors called it mass hysteria. Locals referred to it as the spirit of sickness. Some say it's the brain shutting down under pressure. Others say it's the soul trying to crawl out, and every time, the pattern is the same. Someone moves strangely. Someone forgets where they are. Someone laughs too long, or not at all. Then comes the shaking, the silence, the stare, and then nothing. They walk but do not speak. They breathe but do not rest. They look alive, but something is missing. Sometimes they're medicated, sometimes restrained, sometimes buried quietly, with no name, no visitors, no one to say they were anything but unstable. But if you look closely, you'll see it. The echo of that first man, the one chewing in the schoolhouse doorway, the dancers in Strasbourg. The priest's daughter had black fingers. The woman on the Japanese island was still smiling after death. It's always been here. A plague not of germs or gods, but of silence, isolation, hunger, despair. A sickness that feeds on the mind first and only then takes the body. And when it's done, the people left behind call it madness. But the truth? It's survival. The last desperate attempt of something human trying not to die and trying to keep walking. Even if it forgets how to speak, even if it forgets who it is, even if it scares the rest of us into looking away. That's why we call them zombies. Because it's easier than saying, they are us.